All right, it is 2:15 and I think we're ready to get started with our session here. So thank you to all of you for joining us. We already have over 60 people, which is a great number for this presentation. My name is Jacob Grace. I work with the Savanna Institute. And at this time, if you would like to introduce yourself in the chat, feel free to tell us your name, your location, and your connection to agroforestry and perennial agriculture. We are recording all of our sessions, so you'll have access afterwards to any presentations given during the gathering, including sessions you did not attend. As people are filing in here, we ask that everyone follow some simple Zoom etiquette. Please double check that you are muted and remain muted during the presentation and ask questions using the chat function. I'll be kind of monitoring the chat and collecting questions to use at the end of the presentation. We will be ending the session on time. However, we will be leaving the Zoom room open after each presentation to allow more informal discussion among any people who would like to stay. So I'm now happy to introduce the speaker for this session, Samantha Bosco from the Cornell University Graduate School of Integrative Plant Science. Welcome, Samantha.
Thank you very much. Really happy to be here. Really excited to have so many people coming in and watching this, some familiar faces and lots of new ones. So I also just want to make a quick correction. I'm no longer a student at Cornell University, officially submitted my dissertation and I'm done. Thank you. Yeah, it feels so good. And I'm really excited to give this presentation today. I'm going to tell you a lot more about it soon, but I would love to start things off with a quick poll question for everyone to answer. So if we could please get that launched. And there's just two questions.
It says I'm logged in from another device, so my polling session's inactive. It's probably still logged in as me.
If it doesn't work, that's okay. We can just move on.
Yeah, I can also post the question in the chat and have people respond there. Let me just grab that.
All right, well, I'm going to keep moving on and because I have a lot to share, and if the poll works, great, and if not, we'll figure something out. But I just want to give a quick introduction to who I am. Dr. Samantha Bosco, just recently finished my PhD in the horticulture section at Cornell University. And the title of my dissertation was The Past, Present, and Future Importance of Temperate Nut Trees and Haudenosaunee Sovereignty and Climate Smart Agriculture in New York State. This dissertation will be available soon. It's recently just been submitted, so soon you'll be able to actually access it. And I have been studying and also doing a bit of my own agriculture work since 2005. So I come with almost 20 years of experience here. I'm also just a nature lover, everything from going out to adventuring, like backpacking and camping, to foraging, to also just the way that nature inspires questions and connection to the more than human world. I'm also a queer and trans scientist, and that's going to be a really important aspect of what I share today. And I'm also consider myself to be someone who likes to cultivate community, advocates for social change, and also does work to try to actually engender that. And I just want to thank everyone again for being here. It's really great to have so many folks get to participate in this.
I think I can relaunch the poll if we want to try that real quick.
Yeah, let's go for it.
Okay. Let me know if you see this.
I see it.
Okay. Give folks a few minutes to look over the questions.
Some things I'm noticing right away is that we have a really wide range of people's already inherent knowledge about some of these intersectionalities. And I'm really excited to help to offer some things that might help you feel a little bit more knowledgeable, expand your perceptions or your current knowings. And it looks like also many people here feel how important these social justice issues are. And there's also room for possible growth here too. So I'm really curious to see how this presentation changes and influences and opens up new questions for you all. So a quick overview of what we're doing today is that broadly, people often conceive of agroforestry as a way to address climate action, to achieve climate action. And in this presentation, I'm going to ground this in what are called social transformations for climate change, for climate resilience. And that in order to bridge the gap between agroforestry as a practice and the actual actions required to get climate change action, the importance of diversity, equity, and justice. And I'm going to talk about this through different stories that I'm pulling out, lessons from ecology, and this is where the idea of social ecology comes in. I'll talk a little bit more in a little bit. But we'll be talking about thieves, about the ferality of nature and how that looks in nut trees. We'll talk about the ways in which nature is queer and how therefore agroforestry is also a queer practice. How agroforestry is also very ancient, which I think is something that's pretty well recognized, but we'll talk about some very specific examples. How agroforestry has been and possibly could be a method for resistance against colonial violence. We'll talk about some other kinds of thieves, so some dualities here. And then we'll start questioning regenerative agriculture and as it stands now, and really think hard about what it is that we want to be regenerating. And ultimately, and landing on this idea of liberation ecology, which I'm hoping will make connections between agroforestry as something that's ancient and the climate action that we are saying it's capable of doing today. It's just gonna be a collage of research, much of it others' research, but some of it is also based on my own. It's a collage of that, of research, of news headlines, of social media, and what I like to call my own magic. It's going to be very unconventional than a typical technical presentation, and it's going to be very thick. There's lots of things in here. It'll probably take the entire hour, but I'll definitely stick around to answer questions. I really hope to make time for that. And there's not only is there so much here, there's also so much that is not able to be presented. And this is really just the start of a conversation. This is a really new concept that it's a concept I've been thinking about for a long time, but this is my maiden voyage, so to speak, for presenting this. So I'd love your feedback and love to see what this moves in you, where this is taking you. And also just want to foreground that we're going to be talking about some things that are unconventional in agroforestry. We're going to be talking about love for corvids and rodents. We're going to be talking about sex and gender and sexuality. We're going to be talking very squarely about colonial violence. I will be critiquing regenerative agriculture, hopefully to generative and positive ends. And I will, of course, as someone who studies nuts, we make bad jokes and we make puns, and that is just, that's what happens. So we're going to start by talking about regenerative agriculture really briefly. This is the definition. I know there's many definitions of regenerative agriculture, and there's not one single one, but what I foreground here, Kiss the Ground is an organization that's trying to create certification for regeneratively produced goods. So they're looking to actually codify the idea of regenerative agriculture, and they want us to remember that we are nature and not separate from it, and how we treat the nature has profound effects on the way that on our society and the earth. But they also say that regenerative agriculture focuses on improving soil health by moving carbon from the atmosphere back into our soils. And so I'm wondering how this can be. And so I know that this idea, here we are in an agroforestry conference. This is a pretty hard departure from what I think many of us feel very comfortable with. I think a lot of us believe that planting trees is a really great thing, and in many ways it is. But if we think about it, and what I want to do is I want to examine this solution of taking carbon out of the atmosphere and putting it into the terrasphere as missing the point for the social justice things that we need to get done. Because if we look actually to a different source, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they say that navigating a world that does not, where the temperature has not gone above 1.5 degrees Celsius, stresses the core commitment to social justice, solidarity, cooperation, and particularly regarding redistribution of responsibilities, rights, and mutual obligations. And then in navigating these inclusive and socially just pathways is going to be fraught with moral and practical and political difficulties with inevitable trade-offs. And this is what I want to talk to you about today. We're going to be flipping the script a bit about agroforestry, and hopefully it will bring us to some new territory will bring us to a better possible future. So in this report on navigating a world that does not exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius, IPCC has identified certain social transformations that are needed. And says that without these social transformations, achieving this sustainable development to limiting warming will be exceedingly difficult, if not impossible to achieve. So right off the bat, we are saying how important social justice actually is to climate change action. And that social justice and equity are core aspects of these transformational changes. And so I want to talk more specifically about what this looks like. In the same report, IPCC identifies many different practices, and I want to just take a few out of here that look at the ways in which social transformations emerge in these land-based carbon sequestration efforts. In one set of scenarios, they see how here they use the acronym CSA, and here it stands for Climate Smart Agriculture, has the opportunity to empower women and improve gender equality, especially when we are talking about highlighting and giving credence to gendered, but also indigenous knowledge. And with the problems here, they face issues with access to land and technology and finances. And so this is one way in which climate smart agriculture is already currently recognized to address some of these social inequalities, specifically with gender. And in many of the same ways, focusing on gender and indigeneity has opportunities to impact positively maintaining biodiversity, as well as who owns or who has rights to crop breeding efforts and whose priorities get prioritized in these kinds of crop breeding efforts, and the way that those continue to unfold. So these are some ways in which the IPCC also recognizes specifically climate smart agriculture addressing social inequalities. And I think for many of us here, it's very well understood or very well known the ways in which diversity contributes to agroforestry. Agroforestry increases, in and of itself, increases biological diversity in agri ecosystems. We're adding trees to open landscapes, and we're often adding different kinds of trees. And that tree crop genetic diversity is often a wellspring of possibility for agroforestry producers. We love to find unique individuals out in the landscape. We see the wild progenitors as sources of fresh genetic material for contemporary breeding efforts. Including plant and animal diversity in agroforestry often increases the climate benefits, whether that's increased carbon sequestration or reduction in emissions of other greenhouse gases. The diversity of agroforestry allows for agroforestry to overyield. That is where the sum of the yields from all the different parts are greater than if those same crops were produced in monoculture. Agroforestry offers many economic diversification for growers. Agroforestry crops in particular appeal, some of them at least, appeal to immigrant communities, and a lot of the genetics that we work with come from other parts of the world. So there's a social and global diversity that's inherent in our in the plants that we use and sell. And that agroforestry also attracts the minds and hearts, this is based on my own personal experience, of people who often really appreciate diversity. I, as someone who is focused on nut crops, I'm always meeting new people who are fascinated by the genetic diversity of nut trees across landscapes, and also of folks who have appreciated the marginalized and the underknown and what has been underappreciated. So speaking of diversity, now that we're kind of foregrounding to the importance of diversity in agroforestry and how that connects to climate justice or climate action, let's try to practice this on the kinds of critters that we love to hate. Animals such as corvids and rodents are often thought of as seed predators or even thieves in our systems. But I'd also like to show how these creatures have been incredibly important, essentially important for the crops that we, especially in agroforestry, the tree crops that we know and love. And so this is where the title Thick as Thieves come in. So on the very literal end of the reading of Thick as Thieves, in the world of nuts, it's actually very undesirable, right? Thick nutshells are not great. It makes it harder for us to get the good food inside. And these thieves often are really challenge our growers. This phrase, thick as thieves, it's actually been translated into many languages. In French in particular, it translates to like thieves at a fair. And if our agroforestry and nut cropping plantings are like the fair, having thieves there is really not a great idea, not really what we want. But I'd like to flip this phrase into a different light, and I want to think about it in terms of social ecology. And I'm using social ecology here pretty loosely. It's something that's been applied to many different fields, not only ecological sciences, but also like social work fields. And so here, social ecology recognizes the importance of relationships between individuals and the intersecting communities and environments that they rely on, that they encounter, and that they ultimately impact. And so if we transform our understanding of thick as thieves into this, what I am seeing, what I want to foreground in everyone's mind, is that being thick as thieves means having close relationships with your peers. It means that we're working together to make decisions. We spend a lot of time together. And this can apply to, perhaps our own families, but also families that we choose, whether those are families of other humans or families of other critters. And being thick as thieves requires relying on each other, or often results in relying on each other to create a shared future. And it tends to imply that we're been plotting or being in cahoots with one another to some sort of ulterior motive. And it can be valiant, but it can also possibly be nefarious. And honestly, I see many people in the agroforestry world as being thick as thieves, looking at the history of agroforestry and the kinds of people who champion it. We've had to get to where we are today, which is, it's been so incredible that we have something like this Perennial Farm Gathering. It's required these really close relationships, spending time together, thinking beyond typical conceptions of family. And I think that people in agroforestry really do have a sense of a shared future. And so I really want us to lean into this idea of being thick with each other to create these hopefully valiant purposes. But we'll see, it can get complicated. So I'm going to go through some of those creatures that we looked at. I'm going to first talk about blue jays. Blue jays in general are scatter hoarders. They take seeds and they disperse them across the landscape, often caching them into the ground. They can disperse seeds up to almost 2 kilometers. And because they transfer seeds in their crop, they prefer smaller seeds. And they end up, research has shown that their caches ended up being preferentially in edge habitats and early succession forests, which often are really good habitats for seedlings to emerge and eventually turn into trees. And they've been credited with helping to expand the post-glacial range of many species in the oak family. This table here shows just some of the many species that blue jays have been observed to move and the location in the US in which they've seen this happen. This graph shows examples of 3 different species in the oak family. So on the top row, we have just oaks in general, and this is based on pollen data. So the pollen data cannot distinguish between all the different species within the quercus genus. So it just looks at them all in conglomerate. The middle row is fagus or beech, and at the bottom we have castaneum, our chestnuts. And what this is showing is just the way in which these plants have spread across the landscape, going back in the vertical axis. We have, or sorry, the horizontal axis is time, thousands of years ago, and so 8,000 years ago. This upper region is where the glacial extent was, to just 500 years ago today. And what I'm really trying to show here is that blue jays have a preference in which seeds they choose, and that has affected the spread of certain species across landscapes much faster than could they have achieved through ground-dwelling animals alone or by their own purposes alone. And I'm going to be showing, I want to show you a quick video from a researcher in Ohio State University showing this blue jay seed preference in action.
When this video begins, one of the chestnuts has already been taken. That was taken by a woodpecker earlier. So the blue jays show up, and this first one, he takes a black oak acorn. This next one takes another black oak acorn. He puts it in his crop there and tries to get a second one. So he squeezes a white oak acorn there, kind of decides he doesn't really like it. Then he grabs that chestnut. So he flies off with 2 of those nuts. And then in the next video, so what we have left here is a black oak acorn, 3 white oaks, and 1 chestnut. So this blue jay takes the last black oak acorn, and then that guy tries a white oak, doesn't like it. So the one comes in, takes the last chestnut. And so this guy, all that's left now are the 3 white oak acorns, and instead of flying off with this one, he decides to just eat it, or begin eating it on the platform there. And so that's kind of an interesting little anecdotal view of what our seed preference results showed. So they kind of took most of the.
So that video just exemplifies the way in which animals have preferences, and preferences are kind of a part of our personalities, and that these preferences and these personality types affect the way in which forest composition evolves and changes over time. So now we're going to, with that in mind, we're going to switch to another set of animals, looking at small mammals and how their seed preferences also have been shown to affect the range shift of woody plant species. So in this study, what they some of the findings, the key findings from the study, they found that small mammals are more likely to remove seeds rather than immediately eat them. So when the mammals go and select the seeds from where they find them, instead of eating them right there, they're more likely to remove them and cache them somewhere else, or maybe not cache them, but bring them somewhere else. And you also saw that with the blue jays. The majority of them took seeds and flew away with them, whereas only when left with the least choicest seed choice did the blue jay just decide to eat that seed right then and there. Once removed, the seeds then had a 50% chance of either being eaten or cached. And if they are cached, 64% of them were just cached on the surface, and 34% of these were cached in the ground. A vast majority of those, so 33% of the total, so probably like 99% of all cached ones were cached in optimal buried sites. And then 2% of the total amount of seeds that were removed became trees. What they also found was that these mammals tended to select larger and harder shelled seeds. So here, this graph shows, this is the y-axis is showing comparison to small thin-shelled seeds. So it's a difference in preference to that reference point. And then the x-axis here is shell hardness. And so we see an increasing linear relationship. And then also seed mass, the natural log of the seed mass. So the harder the seed mass, or the larger the seed mass, the more likely the animals were to choose it. And that those same seed characteristics of hardness and seed mass also impacted how far away animals were likely to take it. And this was only specifically looked at in Quercus and Caria seeds. And finally, that tree seedling emergence, so reaching this small but important 2% germination rate was positively correlated with seed mass. So small mammals' preference for larger seeds was directly responsible or very strongly correlated with the regeneration of those trees in the forests. So now taking this one step deeper, we're going to now look at how the actual composition of the forests can affect species personality types and how those personality types can also affect forest composition. This is not just robotic natural selection. It's not the greatest terminology there, but these animals are individuals and they have reasons and perceptions that affect the way that they choose seeds. So personality types such as the timidness or boldness, the docility of the animals, their activity level, and the amount that they explore their environments all are measurable characteristics that made up what these researchers called personality. And the personality of these animals, the combination of these factors impacted the perception of safety and risk, which kinds of seeds these animals selected, whether or not they chose to cache them or consume them, and also like how many seeds an animal took. I'm calling that seed greed. So all this constellation of personality and these choices affects forest composition, and in turn, human-mediated management onto forests had other effects on these personalities. Some of the findings included that docile mice, for example, they foraged in riskier conditions, and they were more likely to eat higher quality seeds, quality being rated in terms of the percent of oils and proteins. That bold mice took more seeds per event, so they were more seed greedy, but they also were indiscriminate about the kinds of seeds that they chose. Mice that were timid, on the other hand, tended to choose smaller, low-quality seeds because they were often more easily available in the different tests that these researchers did. And the personality effects on safety, on the way that mammals perceived risk was most clearly observed in a mature forest. So human-managed forests tended to reduce the amount of personalities that were encouraged in a forest ecosystem, and that in these human-managed forests, there's much more understory, which tended to dampen the perceived risk or the perception of risk. We'll look about, and then there's another study that followed up on this that looked at the way that land use changed, especially the way that humans-mediated landscapes affected the personality types of small mammals. So this graph is showing the three different lines in this graph are showing three different kinds of forest environments. The red line is what they call the reference forest. This is an unmanaged forest, and these took place in Maine, in the Penobscot National Forests. The blue dashed line was an even age stand, so that was the regrowth after clear cut. And then the gray or the black dotted line is what they called a shelter wood. I'm not exactly clear on what that meant. I looked through the methods and description. It wasn't super well described, but they included it in as a human-mediated landscape. And the y-axis shows the density in the population, and the x-axis shows two different kinds of personality traits, being bold or being timid, and also the activity rate. Activity here was recorded as the amount of times the animals reared up, got on their hind legs. And some of the results I want to show is that these human-mediated landscapes increased the density of the population of bold animals or bold mammals, and also increased the proportion of mammals in the population that were had higher activity rates. And so what are the consequences? What does this mean? So land use change increases bolder and more active personalities. Bolder mammals ended up choosing larger seeds, and that higher activity mammals tended to, so what we see now, if we remember back to the previous slide, it was the larger seed that tended to become later trees, but now in these human managed ecosystems, we're creating personality types of these mammals that end up increasing their consumption of these larger seeds. So there's actually is a potential negative feedback loop happening here, where we're going to possibly negatively affect the regeneration rate of some tree species. So that's a really quick, brief run through of the ways in which these mammals that we love to hate are actually really important in forest regeneration of the trees that we love, and also how they are affected and in turn affect the managed landscapes that we create. And of course, this all has been happening in a world of feral nuts. And what I mean by that is many of us may be very familiar with the cycles of masting. And this graph here is showing the results coming from Ohio. They do a mast survey every year, which is incredible. A lot of states are now recording the number of masts that happen in their forest every year. And it's really great to see this kind of data becoming more and more prevalent. On the y-axis, they're looking at the average percentage of trees that are bearing acorns in any given year. And the red line are red oaks, where the blue line is white oaks. And the orange horizontal line is the average in the red oak family. And the green line, horizontal line, is the average across all years of red oak mass, number of percent of trees bearing in a year. And what I just want to show here is that all of the things that these corvids and rodents are doing are happening in this landscape where trees are almost at random or seemingly at random producing food. And there's not ever really a year-to-year pattern. And we also see an interplay between these two different species. And sometimes these species are synchronized, where they both are having mass years in the same year, and other years they're quite divergent, leading to just very different distributions in trying to understand the way the forest composition has occurred in the landscape. And another diagram is just kind of showing the multi-species effects of masting and how it affects the animals that we sometimes love to hate in a mast failure year or in a non-masting year. The reduction of acorns will reduce mice populations, but mice also predate on moth larvae. And so in a non-mast year, this may actually increase the amount of moths that could potentially affect, our crops. And so what I just want to show here is how complex nature is, and how complex these tree crops have evolved, the complexity that they've evolved in across our landscapes. And ultimately, we have benefited from this complexity, and humans, as I'll show later, really contribute to this complexity. And this complexity, I'm going to make even more complex. We're going to leave the world of just regular biological ecology, and we're going to enter a very new landscape of queer ecology. And queer ecology I love this quote. It expresses queer ecology very well, that life does not need monogamy or heterosexuality to survive. It needs riotous, messy, and mysterious diversity. And that is what I've seen in those small mammals and masked studies. And I hope that that's also become clear. And also queer ecology, I want to talk about it. So it does draw from all of this data that we've been gathering on evolutionary biology, but it also folds into this lessons learned and experiences from the liberation movements of two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, intersex, queer, questioning, asexual, and intersex, and more identities. It also draws from the geography and the histories of these queer experiences. It draws on feminist social studies, ecofeminism, and environmental justice. And really what queer ecology seeks to do and what queer theory seeks to do is to disrupt prevailing cultural assumptions around reproduction, sexuality, and nature. Ultimately, drawing connections between the material world and the cultural world and how that impacts environmental issues, and how all this is mediated by power. And what I mean by this further is that our modern conceptions of the way in which the power of biology, that biology has conceived of scientific facts, things that are knowable, has evolved in a very political landscape. And so this is where the importance of politics gets in, and this is where justice really starts to enter the conversation. In the past, the biology of reproduction has been often considered in terms of human reproduction. And this is obviously very fraught. This is pseudoscience, and it's led to very dangerous understandings about the natural world and about humans who are part of the natural world. Remember back to that Kiss the Ground quote about the connection between nature and humans. And also, there has been through this objectified scientific knowledge of biology and reproduction, there has also been a medicalization of sex and the reduction of sex and reproduction to just desire and identity, as opposed to other concepts such as love and resistance and a future, and shared ideas about the future. So what does this actually look like in the real world? I'm wondering if people in the chat could give a guess as what you think you're seeing in this picture. What are these examples of? Yes, these are examples of life. These are critters. These are animals. This is just a small sample. Yes, folks on a mission. Yes. So these are really just a small slice of actually the over 1,500 animals that exhibit same-sex behavior. And really what I'm trying to show here is that nature is queer. And if humans are connected to nature, then queer people are also part of that nature. And this image of this cardinal here is not just a cute poster, it's actually a real thing. This is an example of intersex in the animal world. And so when this bird was found, it puzzled scientists and also delighted bird watchers. And we see that when queerness is found in nature, it often elicits wonder and sometimes delight and curiosity. We have the cardinal that is half male, half female, lots of this language around halfness and this binary thinking. And to just take a few quotes out of the article, one article about the discovery of this bird, the finding of this bird, the photographer said that it was one of the experiences of a lifetime, and that this bilateral gyandromorph stood out as quote unquote pretty unusual. The photographer was alerted to it by a homeowner, but they wanted to remain anonymous. They didn't want to reveal. There's like this shroud of secrecy around this bird, and was surprised. It was fascinating to me that the photographer thought it was surprising that this animal behaved totally normal. But in theory, it could do whatever it wanted. It could mate with whomever it chose to, depending on its hormonal activity. And the discovery of this bird, ended up prompting lots of really great discussion about sex and gender in nature. Unfortunately, when we see examples of this in the human world, we're met with much, much different reactions. And so just trigger warning, we're going to start talking about some of the hard stuff, because unfortunately, science is politicized. And when we see trans experiences in humans, we see that trans people are deemed as deeply anti-human. That these kinds of, the rise in this kind of hate speech actually increases the incidence of violence. That hospitals, places of health and well-being and regeneration are becoming attacked because they are helping trans people. There's yearly an increasing violence against trans and non-binary humans. And that there's continued threats against us, and that the threats against us are also interconnected to the struggles of other marginalized communities. In this year alone, we've seen over 300 legislative bills targeting trans people, and this has a lot of really damaging effects. So how is it that humans and scientists have this adoration and sense of wonder for queerness in the natural world on one hand, but when we see it in humans who are purportedly also in the natural world, it is seen as something to be erased. And so this is where I think really the power of queer ecology comes in, because queer ecology says that society's norms around gender and sexuality are actually harmful to the earth. And I want to show you some examples of where that has shown up. So also in the chat, any idea of what this is a picture of? Okay, I'm glad that a lot of people are aware of this phenomenon, this obsession with binary gender in our culture that has led to some really damaging environmental effects, sparking intense wildfires. And it's happened many, many times, not only in this country, but in other countries where couples are even being tried for environmental damage in the courts, in this case for polluting a river by dyeing it blue. So in this world that we live in, that we work in, we are so often blinded by binaries. And we see this in the agriculture world too. We're often forced to choose between agriculture or forestry. And I think that agroforestry obviously fits into this, because are we not the logical combination of these two? We are already, it's part of our lore, a part of our history to be something other than, to be something different, to be something in between. We're taught that agroforestry transcends time and changes over time, and that can look many different ways. We're taught that agroforestry is in this in-between world, that it has many possibilities, and that there's strength in that queerness, in that differentness. It brings us to new places that were not possible before. And I just want to, I'm showing, this is a very complex diagram that I don't want to go too far into. This comes from the World Agroforestry Center. And I'm showing it this way just to show how it also is identifying this binary between agriculture and forestry. But I'm going to turn it sideways and expand it so you see more of it. And what I want folks to take away from here is just another example of how when we think about agroforestry, it takes up this middle space. And it can, right now, right, our current legal institutional structure really don't, I think a lot of us understand that agroforestry is very under-supported institutionally, and we're fighting against the current legal system, the current institutional education system. A lot of us here, the practitioners, the forward thinkers, we are somewhere, we're definitely further along, and then we have so much other great places to go. And so what I just want to take away from here is the in-betweenness that agroforestry is conceptualized as, is promised to us, and I believe is actually true. And we're also been taught from a long time that tree crops protect the marginal folk, not only the food that is underappreciated, but the kinds of landscapes. And if people are part of nature and nature is part of people, then queer justice has to be included in agroforestry, and understanding queer issues, I think, is very important for agroforestry. To take this further, I'm quoting here a trans ecofeminist artist from the 90s who wants to get away with this idea of opposites, right? Thinking about our cardinal here. Our cardinal is not half male, half female. It's a unique being. It's a singular organism. It is all of one life. And so queerness gets to offer a different paradigm for human relationships and our relationship with the natural world. Because in non-binary dreaming, there doesn't have to be these opposites. And if you take away that binary, there's just everything, right? We have the whole spectrum. And like, this is the happy world in which agroforestry, I think, belongs, in which it is inherent to. In agroforestry, we have these very many different kinds of, we have a whole spectra of practices, just like we have the spectra in the visual spectrum of identities. And there's also a spectrum of, and I want to relate this to the ways in which even our understandings of the LGBTQ alphabet, they're just labels, right? These labels only have so much meaning because there's so much diversity within the labels themselves. So I'm just drawing parallels between non-binary and queer thinking and agroforestry as a practice, right? This is the rainbow connection. I love this part of the song. All of us under its spell, we probably know that it's magic. And someday we'll find the rainbow connection, the lovers, the dreamers, and me. And this is what I have found really appealing to me personally about agroforestry, why I find I have a home here. But also, I think a lot of us here, a lot of folks I've talked to also feel as if agroforestry has some kind of magic to it, some kind of potential, some unknown, some X factor. And we want to see it as this connection to a better world, to this world that we're dreaming of, where we don't have colonial violence, where we don't have violence against queer people, where we don't have violence against immigrants, where we have true justice. And this would be a really beautiful, happy vision and future. However, here again, we're going to take another hard departure, because if we don't also think about lines of power here and the history of the way that power has influenced this, then we're just rainbow washing agroforestry. And so we're going to take a hard turn and talk about some of the problems and the history of politics and the history of power and colonialism, and how it has affected land use today and the field of agroforestry. And I'm going to be taking my cues from Indigenous activists, and they talk about whitewashing, how regenerative agriculture often is whitewashed, and if we're not careful, we can also rainbow wash it as well. And so one of the major interventions here and calls for consciousness is that before I talked about without the binary, there's just everything. And I had this beautiful rainbow and it was just like gorgeous and magical and glitter. However, we did not attend to history, right? And the history is where the dirty details are. Unfortunately, unfortunately, history is often excluded, and we need to bring that back in because people have belonged to the land rather than the land belonging to people. And to heal the land must also include healing people and vice versa. So I want to dive into a history of the land that I come from, land that I work in. And I hope that you can take the lessons there and apply it to where you live. And this particular, what I'm showing you here comes from Instagram posts by the Cultural Survival account. So check them out if this sparks joy for you, or sparks questions, sparks. So I live in what is today called Ithaca, New York, which is in the Gaigahono territory here, which is part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which is a confederacy of 6 sovereign nations, which all speak different but related languages. This is the birthplace of contemporary democracy, and amongst many other amazing indigenous ingenuities here. I want to also point out that the Haudenosaunee emerged in this landscape also in the community of other nations surrounding them. And these are not necessarily the best words for these folks. Here I've included what we call the self names for these people, but the anglicized and colonial names are also on this map. And these peoples had similar kinds of traditions, but also very different, and similar languages, but they were distinct and different. And so this is just a landscape of cultural difference that I want to show you where agroforestry, Northeastern agroforestry came from. This is ancient AF, ancient agroforestry. The map here comes from a dissertation from a Cornell archaeologist, or she got her dissertation at Cornell, no longer there. And what we're seeing here is a simulated map of forest disturbance in Seneca territory. Seneca are, just a quick reference going back for those who are not familiar with this landscape. Their traditional homelands are in West Central New York. And the triangles are actual locations of archaeologically known indigenous settlement sites. And then the circles are the modeled disturbance radii so when the villages were established, they required harvesting trees to create agricultural centers and residential centers and building material and firewood. That obviously caused disturbance, as ecologists would call it, in the landscape. And the settlements would be lived in for about 40 years on average, and then relocated. And so in between, each one of these panels represents 50 years. And so we can see it going from A to B. This is in between the years 1550 and 1650. And this is really before colonial invasion really took place, was really hitting hard in this landscape. And what we can see in that like pre or peri-colonial time is that the resettlement locations were in very close proximity to the prior settlement locations. And that within the time span of the forest regeneration, we'd have a very different successional forest reoccurring there within a very short, perhaps a day's walk distance. And we know that these early successional trees were often fruit and nut bearing and edible species, what we would call like forest gardens. And we see, and the other panels here show continued migration across the landscape. Between C and D, we see, or between B and C rather, there is the effect of colonization causing migration to happen much further distances as actual wars start to happen. But this is at the time of colonial invasion, there's already a network. And imagine that, these networks of settlement establishment and relocation and the regrowth of these forests has been happening for millennia. And so the forests have been transformed by this process for that time. And when the colonists entered, the quote unquote wild lands the forests that they entered into were not wild. They were part of cultural landscapes. And there's a lot of evidence, specifically coming from this territory, this part of the world, bringing data to that. And I'm just and these are just some papers that I would love for you to read if you're really interested. And I'm just gonna go over a very few of them for time's sake and for demonstration. So in particular, we're gonna talk about oak savannas. Oak savannas are not typically thought of as a naturally occurring ecosystem in New York State, although they might happen on very poor soils. And but they had actually, what happened was when this part of the land, this west part of Western New York, was being colonized and set up, there were land surveys that measured and identified all the trees. And what the researchers did here is they took spatial correlations of where those trees lined up. Also, there are mentions in these journals about where oak savannas occurred, where there was examples of fire and examples of oak trees surrounded by grass and open landscapes. That was very puzzling and was just puzzling to them. And they found there's a very high occurrence, the spatial connection between oak savannas and the accounts of burning, as well as accounts of Native American land use. So this could be old cornfields, as well as indigenous settlement sites. And they're able to spatially model the occurrence of where oak savannas were likely to be at the time of colonial invasion. Another paper based on, so here you can see those grids, the land survey grids. And using that same data, they then modeled the prevalence of fire-adapted tree species, which are often, the majority of them are also mast-producing tree species across this part of Seneca territory. And so we see a huge aspect of the landscape has historically been mediated by fire, and the forest ecology shows this. The same methods were also done in the more eastern portion of the state, and they found something very similar. So you can see how these studies are happening more and more, and it's really excellent to see this data coming out. The agroforestry can also be, not only is it ancient, but it can also be a source of resistance. And at this time, a little bit earlier, there was a missionary who was complaining that they was not able to save souls during this time period because, as he was quoted, as for a long time, there has not been a more abundant crop of nuts than in the previous year. The joy of this whole people is so great that one sees only games, dances, and feasts, which often reach the point of debauchery. And so here we have agroforestry and a love of nuts as resisting colonization, resisting conversion. But if it gets whitewashed and the history gets forgotten, agroforestry only gets seen as a pleasure garden. And what I mean by that is focusing on these settlement patterns again. I want to zoom in on this one tiny portion and expand this to show that there's also travel journals from two missionaries going between these two sites, White Springs and what has been recently called New Genesahe. And they were quoted saying, the surrounding country, as through their journey there, was very pleasant, like a pleasure garden in the desert, to which I know no comparison in this country. And coincidentally, pawpaw and persimmon charcoal wood was found at these archaeological sites, indicating that these trees were here in such a prevalence that the Seneca peoples could cut down the trees and use them for firewood without, possibly, the inferences here is that they wouldn't have they wouldn't be, it wasn't, they wouldn't be taking away a food source. There's such an abundance in the landscape that they can use them for wood. So if we don't attend to power, and here we have the agents of colonization, these missionaries appreciating the garden, but yet they maybe don't really connect that they're also the ones who are destroying this and are actively attacking that pleasure that they are experiencing.
Samantha, if you don't mind, I'm going to interrupt for just
Yes.
a second.
Yeah.
We are at time. I want to just take a second to say that and to mention our next session, which is coming up at 3:30. That's going to be a session on land access. But as we said, we're kind of keeping the Zoom rooms open. So Samantha, if it works for you, you're welcome to just keep rolling with your presentation here. And if people need to leave and take a break or get ready for the next session, I just want to give them a chance to do so. But yeah, thanks again for everybody for being here, and we'll keep rolling with Samantha.
Thank you. Yeah, I apologize for this taking longer. We'll get to the end. Thank you for sticking around forever who can. So I want to show what's happening next in this time series in which the Empire State evolves. In this time period in the 18th century, Euro-American settlers view the forest as something that's savage, unhealthy. And here again, we see the leveraging of science, especially the medicalization of science, for nefarious purposes, and often a misuse of science for that reason. This is also wrapped into a racial hierarchy of capitalism, in which folks like Thomas Jefferson felt that Haudenosaunee societies did not produce excess goods, nor did they have capital markets. And so therefore they had no society, and therefore no nation, and therefore no national territory. These were the logics used to dispossess and create New York State. That the land survey as a technique for commodifying land and state formation was also a strategy for removing peoples in upstate New York. And that forest clearing was the primary aspect to do this. Here again, I'm just highlighting one example of this misuse of science, that this physician claimed that draining marshes would make the country healthier. And all of this was used to dispossess Haudenosaunee peoples. And this is another example of landscapes of fear, going back to this, that previous research. And what this resulted in is a loss in over 99.5% of indigenous territory for indigenous peoples. And even later in the history, in the late 1800s, with the establishment of the land grant institutions in New York State, Cornell University is our land grant institution. And at the time of the Morrill Act, which created the land grant institutions, there was no more indigenous land left to take in the state. And the Morrill Act of 1862 actively took indigenous lands for the land grant institutions to use for their programs. And so Cornell had to go further afield and became the largest economic beneficiary of this indigenous dispossession. And so these are the other thieves. We had the valiant thieves and we have the nefarious thieves. So I just want to identify that difference. And so going back to connecting how a recognition of the damage done by binary thinking and the way that harms ecology, and how that is directly connected to the racial hierarchies of capitalism and state formation, has led to vast, not only colonialization and attempted genocide, but we also have deforestation as a result, and the quest for land and for goods and for taming the ecosystem. And I'm going out on a limb to say this, but remember that the chestnut blight was imported to the US in 1876. That happened right after the US Perry mission in Japan in 1853, which was a manifest destiny approach to global relations, which only manifested in chestnut blight. we sent gunboats to Japan demanding that they open up trade. And this is what happened. And I'm not saying that it would not have happened ever, like not that we would never have gotten the chestnut blight, but it would have happened different. Things would have been different. There would have been a different time scale. And so we need to think about this, especially today. We need to think about, what are we regenerating? Are we just regenerating colonialism in regenerative agriculture? In my own research, I surveyed nut growers in New York State, asking them to identify what kinds of agricultural management practices they identify with. I didn't provide any definitions. I let them self-choose. They could choose multiple. I really wanted to know where their hearts and their minds were. And regenerative and permaculture were two overwhelmingly selected categories. And we need to go back to, what does this mean? If we're looking to not damage, but improve ecosystems. Can we do this only through focusing on soil carbon? Is that what's going to work? And there is this acknowledgement that these are not new practices, that indigenous peoples have been doing this forever or for many thousands of years, but now they're just claiming their opportunity to blend this wisdom, right? Where's the attention to justice here? Is this just another marketing ploy based on cultural appropriation? Because remember that IPCC, it calls us an imperative to commitment to social justice and solidarity between nations, and indigenous nations must be included in that. And that this is going to be fraught with moral and practical and political difficulties. There are some things that are happening that are good. For instance, I'm seeing the rise of cooperatives in our movement, and I think that's really excellent. That's a way of building justice and solidarity and cooperation. But we still really need to interrupt carbon colonialism, extractive relationship to land, and barriers to diversity. We still need solidarity with Indigenous, Black, Brown, trans, and queer and migrant issues. Because the IPCC, of course, as maybe a guiding post for many of us, has not been shy in talking about colonialism as a driver for climate change, and as Indigenous peoples as sources of adaptation. But of course, as we have seen, Indigenous people have known this for so long, and they're just like, finally, y'all are listening to us, but we also need to listen to them. And they're telling us carbon markets and nature-based solutions are rooted in these continued colonialization mindsets, right? And so this is the work that we have to do as agroforesters, as perennial farmers, as folks who believe in the good parts of regenerative agriculture. We need to undo this. We need to understand the relationships, the history, so that we can not repeat the mistakes of the past, and we can achieve climate, social, and economic justice. This is just more data showing outside of Haudenosaunee territory, the impact that Indigenous peoples have had on different forests across the world and biodiversity. And hopefully the future looks like this. Looks like land back. 2022 has been the best year for land back yet. And in Haudenosaunee territory, some of this justice is starting to happen. Land stolen in the 1800s is now being returned to the Mohawk people. Onondaga Nation is getting, up to 1,000 acres. But this is a tiny slivers of what's rightfully these people. So while this is a really great direction, we need to be thinking bigger and working towards doing this more. And this all, we have ways of, this is all part of a collective liberation. And this, what I'm showing here is the cycle of liberation, which comes from Bobby Jo Harrell. This is the corollary to her cycles of oppression. And I don't have time to go into all of this right now, but I hope that you look further into this. And I want to say that, we've been engaging in the top third of this today. I'm hoping that for many of you, this is a wake-up call, that this helps gain inspiration, and helps dismantle some of the beliefs that maybe we had before. This is me reaching out to you and hopefully giving tools. And I hope that you can, I'm hopeful that this has inspired some kind of interpersonal change within you. But the rest of this, so we've done some of this work already today, but the rest of this is where the real work comes. This is going to be what we devote ourselves to the rest of our life, to building community, to coalescing our power, to creating change and to maintaining that change and being ready for future challenges that will arise. And there, we need to keep diversifying the kinds of knowledges that we draw on. That our liberation ecology is going to be liberation for migrants, liberation for sexuality, liberation for reproduction. It's going to be decolonized and will include reparations. And we will celebrate diversity in all of its forms. Here are some of the many resources that I draw on. Some I've contributed to, like this ethnobiology paper, and there's many more out there. This has been part of my personal learning pathway. And I'm finally getting to the end here. So stick with me, I hope you can. Coming back to liberation for these folks, for the critters. And I want to point out one of the really powerful findings from this study is that they show that an anthropogenic habitat modification shift the distribution of personalities within a population, as we talked about increasing the proportion of bold, active, and anxious individuals. But we demonstrate that preserving diverse personality types within a population is critical for maintaining the key ecosystem functions of seed dispersal. So before we looked at this was the problem, right? This was the anxiety-producing world of, right? This is the landscape of fear. But what if we look here instead? What if we look at how the natural ecosystems creates a diversity of personality types, creates difference, and it creates a reduction in the activity, or maybe this is also a signal of anxiety in populations. We have a much chiller, for lack of a better word, population. That's good. These are the importance of safe spaces. A lot of people, and this is, of course, part of the queer agenda, is creating safe spaces, because we believe in radical empathy. Queering the food system always believes in finding the value in diversity. And so we have to pick between the kinds of thieves that we're going to be thick with. I want to be thick with this one and this one and this one. And I definitely want to be thick with this one and with the debauchery. And let's bring in the fire and the rainbows and the glitter. All of you are wanted. So I want to thank you all so very much for taking extra time to be here. For those of you able to stay to the very end, I really welcome any questions, comments. Feel free to reach out to me on social media or by email. If we have 2 minutes before the next presentation, so we may not be able to answer so many questions there, but thanks for being part of this. This was the maiden voyage of an idea I've been really crunching on for a little bit. Really grateful to the Savanna Institute for this opportunity, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Samantha. You can probably see you're getting a lot of applause in the chat here. And yeah, thanks again to everyone for joining this session. We've got about 2 minutes until the land access session, but as I said, we can leave this room open for a little bit longer. If people have any questions or anything they want to drop in the chat, we'll hang out for just a little bit. So again, thanks for being here and enjoy the rest of the PFG.